You're listening to the Cheryl Lacey Show, where curiosity meets courage. And joining us now is Menachem Vorchheimer, human rights advocate, and we are going to be discussing the recent announcement of the Royal Commission on Anti-Semitism and Social Cohesion. Welcome to the show.
Good morning, Cheryl. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, and our condolences once again to all of those affected by the horrendous Bondi tragedy last year. And may I say my condolences to you for what is still to come, no doubt, in terms of trying to manage and deal with the ongoing anti-Semitism and what the government is purporting to do to stem that. It must be quite a challenge for you and your community.
It is. And Cheryl, do you mind if I digress a little bit?
Sure.
To give it a bit of context. Many years ago, I had the privilege of meeting a gentleman by the name of Michael Osgood, who's the commander of the New York Police Department's Hate Crimes Task Force, which was the Pacific unit within New York Police Department to deal with prejudice-motivated crimes. And he explained to me why they set up a hate crimes task force. And hopefully this resonates and makes people understand why a massacre of the nature that happened in Bondi is not just about the 15 people that were murdered, the 41 hospitalised and those in the immediate area, but how it impacts a larger community. And what Michael Osgood explained to me is when a victim is attacked because of an attribute, the victims are interchangeable. It just so happened that person A happened to be there, but had, for example, you been Jewish and you been there, you could have been the target, or had I been there, I could have been the target. So anyone that identifies with the targeted community thinks, oh my God, had I been there, I could have been the victim of that massacre. I could have been hospitalised. Because the perpetrators of violence based on race or religion or another attribute aren't looking for Cheryl or Menachem or John or anyone else. They're looking for someone with that attribute. And that's why violence perpetrated on the basis of race or religion cuts so deep, because victims are interchangeable. It just happens to be if you are in the wrong place at the wrong time, you could be subjected to it. And that's where the trauma comes from it, because everyone that can identify with that community thinks, oh my God, that could have been me. And more than that, it could be me in the future unless we stop this. So therefore there's this ongoing trauma and anxiety is probably the right way to put it, that this is not going to stop, and tomorrow it could be me or, God forbid, my child or somebody else.
When was this task force established?
Now you're pushing me. I met Michael Osgood back in 2007, and they'd already been around for a number of years. So, that's probably, I would guess at least 2 decades ago.
Okay. Is it likely that it was something to do with 9/11? No,
I think it was pre 9/11.
Okay.
So my understanding was their research showed that communities as a whole go into this anxiety. They need to respond quickly. They need to prosecute as quickly as possible. And you also need to regularly interact with the affected community. And as you would know, cities like New York have large, not just Jewish communities, also African American communities and other diverse communities. And it was really about responding to that and understanding how an attack of that nature affects the whole community. And just I remember there was a case many, many years ago in Melbourne of a young Sudanese boy called Leah Goni. Do you recall that case where he was bludgeoned to death with a metal pole?
No, how long ago was that? I haven't heard of that one. Please share.
I think it was around 2007, maybe. I don't think it was 2008. I think it was around 2007. But long story short was these two persons had a bit to drink. They went out. They walked out the back door, and the girlfriend said, "Where are you guys going? We're going to find ourselves a person of that colour to take out our anger on." And they came back home, and the pole was bent, and there was covered in blood. And they described what had happened. And the trauma was that they'd gone down to a train station. There'd been a group of Sudanese youths. These two gentlemen chased them, and one of them couldn't get away. This was this boy, Leah, and he was bludgeoned to death. But Leah wasn't who they were looking for. They were just looking for somebody of that description. And so therefore that whole community goes into trauma. And that's really what I guess is the horrible part about prejudice-motivated crime, is they're not looking for, as I said earlier, John or Menachem or Cheryl or anyone in particular. They're looking for someone with an attribute. So the anxiety that hits that community is significant unless that problem's addressed.
It's quite an issue, because as soon as you start introducing hate laws, it actually makes it even more difficult to highlight exactly what you're saying and the need for understanding and acceptance of difference, and then the way in which we learn to live together responsibly. And we know the first rule is first do no harm, and then it is take responsibility for your actions. And if we are going to put too much into the hands of government, particularly through this Royal Commission, it really does water down the opportunity for exactly what you're discussing with us and sharing, and that is the identification of a particular identity, not the individual.
Yeah. And I think, we talk a lot about, the Royal Commission and all those laws, but, the Australia that I come from and the Australia I was born in, we didn't have what we have today. My grandfather was a rat at Tobruk. My father's, that's my mum's side. My dad's side, Holocaust survivors. I went to Sydney Boys High, which is a mainstream school, so to speak. And, we didn't have that level of hate that we have today. And I think really what we need to do, whilst I welcome the Royal Commission into anti-Semitism, we need to address and call out the elephant in the room, which is Islamic extremism. And Islamic extremism, perpetrator Bondi, it's a radical form or misinterpretation of Islam. But, that same radical ideology and extremism also perpetrated many other terrorist acts, whether it be 9/11, as you mentioned a moment ago, or, the Bali bombings and the things of that nature. That's all driven by extremism. And unless we deal with that extremism, we're going to have another form of another attack. It may not be an anti-Semitic attack, but it could be some other form of terrorism. And I think that's what scares me. I don't think the government's calling out the elephant in the room.
They're certainly not. And a couple of points there that you've made. 9/11, it's very close to me. I was there at the time with my 5-year-old daughter, so lived through that and observed leadership at its best with Mayor Giulliani, bringing the community together immediately and encouraging everybody to help one another. And it was an extraordinary, whilst quite traumatic and horrifying experience, the if I could say, the calm and love coming from one another and complete strangers was something I've never experienced before, and I'll be forever grateful. The other thing you mentioned is that you have got a long history here in Australia with your family, and I'm fascinated that you're an 8th generation Australian. So that says everything, doesn't it, about your awareness as a whole family unit, generationally, of these changes that you speak of. I can only say that I'm a 5th generation, with my great-great-grandparents arriving in the 1850s. So we are such a rich Judeo-Christian society that is now, as you say, under threat if we don't deal with Islamic extremism and radical Islam. How do you think we start to stem that, putting the Royal Commission aside? How do you think we can start educating Australians?
Well, I think you first have to call out the problem before you can address it. And I think if we keep skirting around it, we avoid it. And it's interesting, and I'm sorry to hear that you and your daughter were in New York during that horrible terror attack, and I cannot imagine what that would have done to you. But you mentioned the mayor at the time was a mayor called Rudy Giulliani, and there's a really interesting bit of history about him. He inherited New York when it was riddled with crime, and he adopted a theory called the theory of broken windows. Are you familiar with that?
I am, but please share it with our listeners.
Yes, so in the short compass of the theory of broken windows is that if you address small crimes, small misdemeanors, and that's why it's called the theory of broken windows, such as broken windows, graffiti, people jumping turnstiles, they call them in New York, it stops the next level of crime.
That's right.
So if you crack down the small things, the next level of crime doesn't transpire because you develop a culture of a lawful society rather than lawlessness. And I think that's really the root cause of trying to address Islamic extremism. You first have to call it out. You first have to then crack down on hate preachers. You have to get, we'll call it advocates within the moderate Islamic community to call out the extremists and say that that's a misinterpretation of the text, that is the wrong way to go about it. And we have to build that kind of language that we're pushing back, not just from the authorities and the government, but, we're getting champions within the Muslim community to push back at the extremists, to make them non-legitimate, to not give them a seat at the table, to deny them government grants, to deny them government funding, to tax deductibility status. We really have to cramp down on it with this zero tolerance and not wait till it expresses itself in the most extreme forms in terms of violence, but really root it out from society and make it something that is seen as, unacceptable. And we see that now, yesterday Thomas Sewell, the head of the neo-Nazi group, said he's going to disband before the 18th of January because he's read the legislation, he's read the tea leaves, and knows that if he continues after that date, he and his members will be charged. And I think if we send such a very strong message in relation to Islamic extremism, we have a chance to push back at it rather than address the symptoms of that, which is a massacre that happened at Bondi. And we can't address the symptoms all the time. We need to address the root cause. Absolutely.
And I note that the Simon Wiesenthal Centre in the United States, I believe their head office is in California, made this very profound statement. And if I could just read it out to you. Let us be clear. Australia's intelligence and law enforcement professionals are capable. The failure here is political. Rhetoric emanating from the Prime Minister's office that stigmatised and demonised Israel helped normalise anti-Semitism. Do you and your broader community have that view as well?
Well, 100%. I mean, we had Mike Burgess, the Director General of ASIA, the Australia Security Intelligence Organisation, say in February in Senate estimates that anti-Semitism was the number one threat that his agency was dealing with, which talks to exactly what the Simon Wiesenthal Centre said, that the agencies had that capacity to have the tools and the ability, but the failure to deal with it is really political. And what's really, I don't know if the right word is perverse or ironic, is in the terms of reference for the Royal Commission, they cite the definition of anti-Semitism as the IHRA definition.
Yes.
Which at its core states the following, that Jews are not collectively responsible for the actions of the State of Israel. And if you looked at what the terrorists who perpetrated Bondi were motivated by, it was apparently, allegedly, deeply anti-Zionist, which was about, in essence, a foreign country and the foreign country's policies. So, and they weren't the only ones. We see that in the rallies in the streets of Sydney and Melbourne and around Australia, where we have slogans, all Zionists are terrorists, or we're baby killers and genocidal. You use dehumanising language and you cast blame on us for a foreign war. What happened to Bondi is a natural consequence, and really it was the weasel word and the absence of leadership, like you talked about Giuliani had leadership, Albo doesn't have leadership, that enabled Bondi. And we're still seeing, the draft bill that's come out has a carve-out clause that said religious teachings could be exempt. Well, we're back at ground zero again, I think, unless we change that.
Well, it depends on what religious teachings are, and I take your point entirely. I've always argued that we don't have Australian schools, we have schools in Australia, two very distinct things. And working in your community, as I did in the United States for a number of years with the New York Board of Jewish Education, you identify very clearly what those teachings are and how well they merge, your religious values and the Judaism with what is essential for your own children to be able to have the fundamentals that are required for moving on successfully in life. We don't have that here. And I see time and again, you mentioned a little bit earlier, the constant of funding going to what is totally against what it is that you and I understand Australia to be, and particularly given our ancestors worked so hard in that Judeo-Christian environment.
Yeah, and I think, Cheryl, and I dare say that would have been your experience, we might be Jewish, but we're deeply patriotic and loyal to the countries in which we live.
Absolutely.
So if you were living in the United States, the kids in those schools would have been aware what the American anthem was, what the American flag looked like, the American values. They would have gone to baseball games and football games,
yes,
and all of that. Kids, some of those kids would have gone on and served in the U.S. military. The same is true in Australia. We all know the Australian anthem. We all play cricket, football, or AFL, or rugby, whatever it is, we're deeply immersed. We don't see ourselves as separate and distinct. We have a religious identity, but we're Australian Jews. We're not, that's how we see ourselves. We see the two as coexisting. We don't see ourselves as separate and distinct from society.
That's right. And you mentioned the IHRA earlier on, which is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and the working definition that they came up with for anti-Semitism was back in 2015, as I understand it, and even then they were talking about collectivism, and clearly that being a problem, as you said earlier, that it's one person, all people with a particular feature or characteristic or belief is the target. And my understanding is, interestingly, that it was Anthony Albanese that was the one that agreed to that working definition in about 2022, is my understanding. It wasn't in the other major political party. So it's been a long time coming, even to have those conversations about, albeit that it's not legally binding, a definition that we can start working with that then enables us to start working with the definition of Islam and radical Islam and so forth.
Yeah, but it's really uncontroversial, that notion that a person in this country is not responsible for a foreign conflict. The fact that we're even having the conversation just shows how perverse the world has become, because we don't hold Russians or Ukrainians or Chinese or anyone else from every other ethnicity or religion responsible for some foreign conflict.
No, we don't.
For some reason, Jews are made to feel that way, and I think that's really the problem. Where's this perverseness coming from? We've got a terrible situation at the moment where we have, reportedly this morning, we're up to 12,000 people have been murdered in Iran, and there's almost silence, crickets, as they say, from that same leftist movement that jumped up and down around Gaza and that. Well, where are people protesting about Iran? This regime could kill tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or more in a very short period of time, but no one's saying anything.
It's fascinating. We have a US correspondent on every week, Lawrence Rogak, and we were just having that very conversation, and he is just that, shocked and horrified, exactly as you said, of the silence. And I believe there's something in the Australian today as well, that the headline is something to the effect of "Where's Greta and all the left-wing celebrities who would normally be jumping up and down over an issue like this?" So you're absolutely correct. Why do you think this is the case?
I don't know, but it's interesting you should mention Greta as an example, because what are the people in Iran protesting for? Protesting for one of the most simple things, for example, women to be able to show their hair. Right? That's a form of female identity and independence.
Yes.
And I would have thought that would have talked directly to someone like Greta and all the people within that movement, because Germaine Greer and all the people in that era were all about women's rights, about equality of women. And what do these Iranian women want to do? They want to live equal, so to speak. They want to be able to go out and get jobs. They want to be able to uncover their hair. They don't want to be, subject, to second-class status by mere fact of being a female. But all these people in this movement are silent. I don't know why. One of the hypotheses is that a lot of the protest movements we've seen around the world directed at Jews in Israel have been funded out of Iran. And perhaps, if that is true, that might explain why there is silence now when Iran is the one, the perpetrator, so to speak, of that violence.
So what do you suggest that we do from the bottom up to start these conversations, and where might we get the most accurate information to be able to do that, not only respectfully, but to start the necessary change that's required so that we can all live together in a safer Australian community?
I think this great Australian song, "We are one, but we are many." At the end of the day, we're all one heart. And I think what we need to come back to is what you mentioned a little bit earlier, that really we are all one people. We didn't break out into these clusters. And we need to push back about this notion that Islamic extremism is acceptable. We need to push back about this notion of a divisive culture. And I think that, we shouldn't be shy in speaking out. I think it's okay sometimes to call out government or something that's not right. And I think just having a view is a good thing. And I think that's a good starting point. The other one that I don't know about you, sometimes when I'm having a bad day and a stranger says hello to me or something positive, it can lift me. And I think sometimes, one beautiful things we can do, just randomly say good morning to strangers and be positive and bring back that notion of, the old days when I grew up as a kid, no one locked their front door.
That's right.
We rode our bikes until the sun went down. Parents didn't really worry too much where we were. I'd like to get back to an Australia that we don't worry so much. There's a lot more trust and a lot more goodwill. And I think that starts off with by nice, positive language and people speaking up for each other and sticking up for each other.
I love those two words that you just used, trust and goodwill. And trust is certainly something that we all could do with a dose of. And in terms of that trust, you talk about leaving doors open and so forth. It comes back to what you mentioned earlier with Rudy Giuliani and the theory of broken windows. It seems that minor grievances and these law breakers that are doing these, I wouldn't say minor acts, like house break-ins and stolen cars and things like that. We've seen that just rampant, particularly here in Victoria. So we've got a state issue that's actually not going to be essentially raised at the federal level because it seems to be narrowed with this Royal Commission. And I've read through it, and I'm working with a working party on Friday on it. So might actually see what we can do to get you involved as well. But to me, I'm concerned about the social cohesion tag at the end of it. What are your thoughts?
I think social cohesion is a bit of a buzzword, and the question was, what does it really mean? I mean, if we were so focused on social cohesion, would we have allowed the type and form of protest that we allowed in this country for the last 2.5 years?
Exactly. We wouldn't have.
I think we just have to call it out. Let's get rid of the buzzwords and let's get back to basics. If we're going to go back to the theory of broken windows, we wouldn't have allowed a lot of those protests, and we wouldn't have allowed a lot of rhetoric at those protests. And I think we need to push back against that and say that's really not freedom of speech. And there is, just to round off because I'm conscious of time, but everyone throws around this notion of freedom of speech. It's an implied right in the Australian Constitution. There's also a right in the Constitution about freedom of religion. The two coexist. And there's a couple of cases, for example, at the federal level, the case of Bolt versus Ecock, and also the state level, Cottrell versus Ross and Catchafine Ministries versus Islamic Council Victoria. And what all those three cases articulate, both at the federal and the state level, is that there is freedom of speech, but that coexists with other rights. So therefore it's not absolute. It's subject to reasonable caveats, such as not inciting serious hatred or ridicule or contempt for somebody on the basis of their race or religion. So therefore, I can get up and I can protest, but it's got to be reasonable and it's got to be measured. And when that language strays into dehumanising words, then we cross that line. And I think it's important to remember that Mike Burgess, in October 2023, not long after the massacre and after the Sydney protest, said the following words. He said, "Words left unchecked will lead to violence." And those words are prophetic, and they're the words that Mike Burgess said publicly, linking that dehumanising language over time creates an environment or permissive environment for attacks. And that's in essence what happened to Bondi. Bondi was the natural consequence of relegating a segment of the community as second class, worthy of attack, of contempt, hate and ridicule, and that's why they were murdered. And they were murdered by people that were anti-Zionists, and so therefore the anti-Zionist movement are partly responsible. And if I may just explain what Zionism is and isn't.
Please.
People all say that Zionism is a political movement, but I think that misplaces it on two levels. First and foremost, is the word Zionism comes from the word Zion or Zion, which is mentioned 152 times in the Old Testament. It's a reference to Israel and Jerusalem. It's a reference to the land, the indigenous homeland of the Jewish people, which goes back over 3,000 years. Second part is 1948, when the people talk about the creation of Israel in 1948, that's not really the creation of Israel. It's the re-establishment of the state of Israel. Because Israel had existed and then had been overrun by other parties.
Yes.
Post the Holocaust, there was a movement for the re-establishment of the state back to its indigenous people, to the Jewish people, and that's really what Zionism is about, was pushing for that. So pre-1948 was a movement for the re-establishment of the State of Israel, and then post-1948, Zionism is about the maintenance of the state, because Israel already exists. So if you're an anti-Zionist, you're not against the notion of creation of a state, because the state already exists. What you're actually calling for is the destruction of the state. It's almost like you're an Australian. If people got up and said, let's kill all Australians and push them out to sea and all the rest of it, people jump up and down. That's in essence what anti-Zionism is. It's a movement that calls for the destruction of the State of Israel, which necessitates murdering or displacing 9 million people. That's what it necessitates. That's ethnic cleansing and a call to genocide. That's what anti-Zionism is at its core. It's not a political movement. It's a movement calling for the destruction of the people and its state.
You've explained that extremely well, and living in fear is probably one of the most horrific things that we can have done to us, as opposed to choosing the fears that we choose to have ourselves, if that makes sense. And in this description, you've taken it to an international level, which is where these conversations certainly must go and where our understandings must go as well. I noted that, just to wrap up, if I could ask you, Saudi Arabia apparently has increased its quotas for paying for Indonesians to go to Mecca for the pilgrimage, and that is under investigation at present. So that's another international action that can likely have consequences around this important conversation that you had, particularly, as you said, with words, and those words being left undetected, and the implications of that. So how much are you focusing internationally? Just before we wrap up, could you give me a quick answer to that one?
So I'm first and foremost an Australian, and my primary focus is on the safety of myself, my family, my community, and the broader Australian society. So my only interest in international matters is understanding how things move quickly from something across the other side of the world to Australia. I see my first and foremost priority being Australia, about you, me, and everyone else, about our society, and getting back to, as I mentioned earlier, a day when we can leave our doors unlocked and trust our neighbours and have that good faith. That's really the Australia I want. So I only look at international affairs to understand how they may impact or flow into this country. But more than that, I don't really have much of an interest.
Look, it's been a remarkable conversation. I can't thank you enough for joining us today. And you are now on my list. Do you realise that? My list of favourite people.
Likewise, Cheryl, thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for all the great work that you do, and also to your listeners for their time.
Thank you so much. I look forward to having another conversation. Thank you.
Likewise.
And please stay safe. God bless. That was Menachem Vorchheimer, human rights advocate, talking to us not as much as I thought we would about the Royal Commission, but more importantly, what has led to the need for that, or indeed whether or not it's worth it at all, because there is so much more that's required. And ultimately it does come back to education, which we know what this show is about. And it's also very much, he said himself, about being courageous and being curious, so that we do indeed understand what Islamic radicalism is, or radical Islam, what it means when we talk about Zionism or anti-Zionism, history as well, and how important history is to our understanding not just of Australia, but its influence through other countries and cultures, behaviours and events. And I just love the conversation that we had about the theory of broken windows, and that was something that Rudy Giulliani and the New York focused on, and that's what led to the great success that he had in making New York one of the most exciting cities in the world. We can do that here in Australia, but I dare say we can't do it with any of our current potential or existing leaders. It's just not happening from a political context. We need change, and I hope that this show contributes in some way to that.